Imagine being trapped in a snowstorm with no heating, no food, and no proper shelter. The wind cuts like razors, the snow blocks the doors, and hunger gnaws at your stomach. But this wasn't just a rough night. This was the reality for millions in the Middle Ages. Today, you will discover how kings, peasants, and warriors struggled to survive winters that seemed never to end. The winter that changed history. The cutting wind shows no mercy. Every gust that seeps through the holes in the wooden house seems to steal what little warmth remains inside. In the corner, an old man wraps himself in rags, trembling, unable to sleep. His breathing is more of a whisper than an audible sound. Outside, the snow buries the village. The doors are blocked, and the residents can barely leave their homes. The supply barns, already nearly empty, hold only a handful of moldy wheat. There isn't enough firewood to keep the fire burning through the night. The only hope is that the storm will pass. But it doesn't. For months, this was the scene across much of medieval Europe. The extreme cold wasn't just a passing problem. It became a new way of life, a death sentence for those who weren't prepared. And the worst part, no one knew what was happening. In the 14th century, the seasons began to change in unexpected ways. Summer shortened, and winter, already harsh in some regions, began to stretch on for months. The Baltic Sea, which was usually navigable, froze over countless times, disrupting trade routes. Entire rivers turned into blocks of ice, making fishing and crop irrigation impossible. For peasants, this was a disaster. Most people in the Middle Ages depended on the agricultural cycle to survive. But now, nature had become unpredictable. When the first harvests failed, people grew worried. When the next winter arrived even colder and more devastating, they began to fear that this was not just a whim of the weather, but a divine punishment. A cold that took Europe by surprise. For centuries, European peasants followed a predictable cycle. Spring brought greenery back to the fields, summer ripened the grains, autumn prepared the land for winter, and then the cold arrived intense in some regions, but always temporary. Until suddenly, the balance was broken. In the early 14th century, Europe's climate began to shift. Winters grew longer and harsher, and summers started to shorten. For centuries, temperatures had been relatively stable, but now, the cold persisted far beyond what was expected. The Baltic Sea, which once flowed freely, froze completely during several winters. Major European rivers, like the Seine and the Rhine, turned into corridors of ice, halting trade and isolating entire cities. The peasants were the first to feel the effects of this change. The crops that once yielded regular harvests began to fail. The soil remained cold for much longer, preventing seeds from sprouting. When spring arrived, it felt like a pale shadow of what it should have been, and when summer came, it was often weak, without enough warmth to mature the grains. For farmers, this was an unprecedented disaster. The food that was supposed to last until the next harvest started running out sooner than expected. What had once been just a difficult phase turned into a deadly cycle. With each passing year, the cold seemed to set in earlier and leave later. Villagers had no answers for what was happening. For many, the only possible explanation was that God was punishing the world. And while peasants sought answers in churches and monasteries, the nobility began to realize that something much bigger was unfolding. But the true devastation was yet to come. Brutal storms and a climate out of control. The cold was already a relentless enemy, but it did not come alone. During the Little Ice Age, the weather became unpredictable and extremely violent. Storms began to strike Europe with unprecedented force, bringing floods, gales, and torrential rains that lasted for weeks without stopping. Peasants who once relied on the land for sustenance began to realize that their fields were turning into waterlogged swamps. The once fertile soil became a foul-smelling mud, incapable of supporting the growth of crops. Wheat and barley, essential for food at the time, simply rotted before they could mature. Records from the period describe times when the sun seemed to disappear from the sky. The gray clouds stretched for months without a single warm day to dry the earth. The relentless rains made dirt roads nearly impassable, isolating villages and preventing supplies from reaching more remote areas. In the ports, the situation was even worse. Merchant ships, which transported food between kingdoms, were destroyed by storms. Furious winds sank entire fleets or hurled them against the rocks. With trade routes crippled, cities began to feel the first signs of supply shortages. And then came the worst. The rivers overflowed. The Thames, the Seine, and the Rhine, lifelines of commerce and survival, became raging monsters, destroying bridges, flooding farmlands, and sweeping away entire houses. For medieval Europeans, it seemed as if the world was collapsing around them. The weather was no longer just a temporary hardship. It had become a real enemy, destroying the land, cutting off food supplies, and leaving millions of people on the brink of despair. But the famine had yet to reach its most terrifying stage. Desperation leads to cannibalism. Extreme hunger erases rationality and turns even the most devout people into beings driven solely by the instinct to survive. When there are no more grains, when the animals have disappeared and the last roots have been pulled from the earth, one inevitable question arises: what is left to eat? In 14th century medieval Europe, the answer to that question became grim. Historical accounts indicate that in some regions, desperation led people to cannibalism. One of the chroniclers of the time, Jean de Venette, describes scenes of horror in France. Families wandered the roads, starving and desperate, waiting for someone weaker to be caught and killed. Parents, driven mad by hunger, sacrificed their own children, believing it was better to eat them than to watch them slowly die of starvation. In Germany, some cities besieged by cold and hunger saw corpses left in the streets begin to disappear. The dead, once buried with respect, were now being unearthed and consumed. In certain villages isolated by snow, those who survived until the end of winter were often the ones who had the courage to resort to human flesh. The fear of cannibalism spread paranoia among the survivors. People accused their neighbors of hiding suspicious meat, and rumors spread about entire families that had vanished overnight. Some fled at the slightest suspicion, fearing they might be the next victims. This horrifying reality was not an exception, but a reflection of what prolonged famine could do to society. And even the most powerful were not spared from this collapse. The nobility also suffers. The reign of Edward II and the crisis of the elite. If peasants and townspeople were on the brink of collapse, it would be easy to imagine that the nobles, surrounded by castles and wealth, were protected from hunger. But the truth is that during the merciless winters of the Little Ice Age, not even kings were immune to the crisis. King Edward II of England ruled during a period of great turmoil. In 1315, one of the harshest winters on record struck his kingdom. The crops failed, roads became impassable, and the food supply was cut off. The problem was so severe that even the royal granaries, usually stocked for difficult times, began to empty at an alarming rate. The crisis was so dire that Edward II was forced to decree that no one could buy more grain than necessary for a single day. But this measure did little to help, as the stocks simply did not exist. Even the castles, symbols of strength and stability, became frozen prisons where nobles watched their banquets shrink day by day. Additionally, the food shortage created unrest among the armies. A starving soldier does not fight, and hunger began to erode the king's military strength. Rebellions erupted in various parts of the kingdom, not only against Edward II, but also against feudal lords who could no longer protect their lands or feed their vassals. The winter and famine weakened royal authority. The desperate population lost faith in the nobility's ability to govern and protect the people. Chaos was setting in, and with the political crisis, new threats emerged. But the worst was yet to come. The climate did not only bring famine, it brought destruction. floods and storms that wiped cities off the map. As if extreme cold and hunger were not enough, medieval Europe faced another deadly enemy: water. The storms did not just ruin crops, they caused devastating floods. The increased rainfall, combined with the melting of accumulated ice, caused major rivers to overflow violently. The Thames, the Seine, the Rhine, and the Elbe turned into destructive forces that wiped entire cities off the map. In 1362, one of the worst climate disasters of the Middle Ages occurred: the Grootmandrank, or Great Drowning of Men. This extratropical storm struck the North Sea with indescribable fury, obliterating entire villages in the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany. Estimates suggest that between 25,000 and 100,000 people either drowned or were swept out to sea. Chronicles from the time report that in some regions, the force of the waters was so intense that it permanently altered the coastline's geography. The sea invaded lands that had once been farmable, and cities that had stood for centuries simply vanished beneath the waves. For survivors, the landscape after the storms was desolate. The fields were devastated, granaries were destroyed, and once fertile soil was now poisoned by salt water. Houses that had not been swept away were reduced to waterlogged ruins. Many who escaped the fury of the floods did not survive what came next: famine and disease, which spread as the bodies of victims began to decompose. These catastrophes did not only claim lives, they also deeply shook the very structure of medieval society. And when people could no longer find safety in their land or in their rulers, they began to question something even greater: their faith itself. The church and politics enter a crisis as catastrophes became more frequent. Endless winters, devastating storms, and failing harvests. People sought answers. And in medieval Europe, there was no greater source of authority than the Catholic Church. For centuries, the Church had assured the people that everything happened according to God's will. Good harvests were blessings, victories in battle were divine rewards, and hardships were tests of faith. But now, with millions dying of hunger and entire villages being wiped off the map, many began to wonder, had God abandoned them? This crisis of faith affected not only peasants, but also nobles and even clergy members. Monks and priests began preaching that the famine and cold were punishments for humanity's sins. Self-flagellation processions emerged, in which groups of believers marched through cities, publicly whipping themselves, believing that through suffering they could appease divine wrath. Meanwhile, kings and feudal lords faced an even greater dilemma. With their lands barren and the population in revolt, their authority began to be questioned. In France and England, the first major peasant uprisings of the Middle Ages emerged events that would foreshadow even greater revolts in the following centuries. The Church, sensing the growing discontent, tried to reaffirm its power. However, with the people starving and priests unable to provide answers, its influence began to weaken. Some religious sects gained strength, preaching that church leaders were corrupt and that the famine was a sign that a new era was approaching. The medieval world was changing, and those who failed to adapt would not survive. But some did manage to find ways to overcome the cold. Through creativity, resilience, and knowledge passed down through generations, certain groups developed survival tactics that ensured their place in history. How medieval people overcame the crisis. Not everyone succumbed to the cold, hunger, and storms. Some communities, determined to survive, developed ingenious techniques to endure the relentless winter. These strategies, ranging from ancestral knowledge to innovations born out of necessity, became the key to resilience amid the chaos. One of the first concerns was maintaining body heat. In more isolated villages, people began reinforcing their homes with extra layers of straw and mud to create thermal insulation. Some settlements in Scandinavia, for example, started building their houses partially underground, using the earth as a natural insulator against the intense cold. The floors of these homes were covered with hay or animal skins to retain internal warmth. Food preservation also had to be adapted. With unpredictable harvests, medieval people began storing food more efficiently. In some areas, grains were kept in pits covered with stones to protect them from moisture and rot. Meat was salted or smoked to extend its shelf life, and some communities began fermenting foods as a method of preservation. Trade also had to transform. With frozen rivers and blocked roads, markets had to be improvised. In northern European cities, entire fairs were reportedly set up on frozen lakes, where merchants sold everything from woolen clothing to small portions of dried meat. Another innovative solution was the reuse of buried embers. Some communities discovered that by burying hot charcoal in ashes and earth, they could preserve embers for days. This meant that fires could be reignited without using up the scarce, remaining firewood, a precious resource when the forests were covered in snow. These strategies did not guarantee comfort, but they offered a chance of survival. Those who learned to adapt endured. Those who failed simply disappeared. But what can we learn from all of this? The lesson from history. The Little Ice Age was not just a climatic phenomenon. It was a brutal test of resilience for all of medieval society. Families were destroyed, entire villages vanished, and even kings and nobles felt the weight of hunger and cold. Those who survived were not necessarily the strongest, but the most adaptable. This period teaches us an uncomfortable truth. The world can change suddenly and unpredictably. For medieval people, the arrival of longer, harsher winters was something no one had foreseen. Today, we live in an era of intense climate change, but are we truly prepared to face extreme weather events without our modern technology and infrastructure? If, suddenly, the global climate underwent another drastic transformation, would we be able to survive like those medieval peasants did?